town in the English Midlands or the North, where all meaning, everything I knew, the entire system of industry, the communities, the prospects of education, all of those kind of things have been taken away from people. If I were one of those people, I would have voted for Brexit. I would have voted for anything that gave a kick to the establishment. But the question is, what's this got to do with the European Union? So in a way, what Brexit does is it's like taking a big wall and putting a big target on the brick wall and saying, kick here.
That's your problem.
If you kick the wall, it feels very satisfying, but you also break your own foot, And of course, it does not address any of the questions of social inequality and exclusion. It's a very clever way, in one way, of a ruling class saying, there's the problem. The problem is over there. Right. However, its great difficulty is the one thing you should never do with a scapegoat is kill it. Because
have it go away.
Who's the scapegoat now? Who is going to be to blame for all of the things that people are very angry about when the European Union is gone?
Yeah, but England or the UK is not alone in creating these imaginary villains either inside or outside the country. And there seem to be a huge supply of these imaginary villains. So I'm not sure when the EU goes away if there won't be another one. Yes. Now, you extend your psychological theory, if I may, not just to talk about the need to take some of the colonial oppression and make it about the English feeling of victimhood, but you actually extrapolated to an American novel, to the 50 Shades of Grey. Explain that to our audience.
Well, 50 Shades of Grey is actually by a British author, and it is the largest selling...
Set in the US.
Set in the US, of course, in a fantasy US. But it's the biggest selling English novel of the period coming up to Brexit. This is only half serious, by the way. I'm not suggesting that 50 Shades of Grey caused Brexit. Although, it's as good an explanation as anything else, maybe. But I was just hoping that I might get a little bit of the S&M erotic market for my book. But it's very funny if you read 50 Shades of Grey, and I do deserve some kind of award because I had to read it in order to write this. But what's very funny about 50 Shades of Grey is that it's not about sex, of course. It's about submission and domination. That's the whole theme of it is about, and the two characters, the female character and the male character, they're referred to as the submissive and the dominant. And this is actually very funny in terms of Brexit because what you get with the Brexit mentality is a drama of submission and domination, right? It's about who is the dominant person and who is having to submit. And this really plays out in this kind of strange way. So this, I think, is where we come back to this afterlife of empire. When everything goes with empire, but maybe a mentality remains in the head. And the mentality of empire is binary. You can only be two things in an imperial system. You are either dominant or submissive. There's nothing in between. If you apply that to the European Union, which has been specifically constructed to make sure that nobody can dominate, that's its fundamental architecture. Why? Because who are they thinking about? They're thinking about Germany, right? So Germany has twice destroyed Europe in the 20th century. You have to construct something that contains a dominant power. And you end up with something. I'm from a very small country called Ireland, which has the same voting rights in a lot of European institutions as Germany has, right? So, it's constructed to stop domination. But if you have an imperial mindset and you say, well, hold on, there's only two things that can be happening here. Either we, the Brits, are dominating Europe, or if that's not the case, we must be submissive. It must be dominating us. And you cannot understand the idea that actually there's a thing called normality. There's a thing called not being dominant or submissive, but just being one country among other countries, sharing space in this kind of very negotiated way. So I think although the 50 Shades of Grey stuff is kind of intended to be funny, I think there is some truth in this mentality of domination and submission that plays out.
Either being dominated or dominating. Be honest.
Yeah.
Fintan, you just mentioned that you're Irish. As Indians, we completely understand the concept of being the former colony.
Yeah.
Is there an element of schadenfreude to all the joy you're taking out of the miseries of your neighbor?
How dare you suggest that any Irish person could ever feel anything but the most profound sympathy? No, actually, the strange thing about being Irish is we feel a little bit like, how dare you engage in crazy nationalistic identity crisis? That's our job. I mean, this is what we do. You know, we've been doing this for a long time, and I've come to the conclusion that there's a kind of fixed amount of crazy nationalistic angst on the two islands, and that as it's gone down in Ireland, it's just kind of risen on the other islands. You know, that's the way it kind of feels. But seriously, no, there really isn't schadenfreude because it affects my country really badly. You know, it's one of the reasons I'm very against Brexit. I make it absolutely clear. I was shouting at the television during all of the big debates on Brexit. Right. You know, saying, when are you going to talk about Ireland? When are you going to talk about the border? When are you going to talk about the very, very carefully constructed peace process in Northern Ireland? And of course, the answer to that question was never. We're not going to talk about it. It doesn't exist. Brexit is a clean break from history, which means also a clean break from responsibility, from any sense that you have pre-existing conditions that have to be satisfied in any kind of arrangement. So yes, I do and did feel very angry about Brexit. It's not schadenfreude, though, because unfortunately this hurts us too.
It does hurt you. And I do want to come to the future, particularly of the Union, as well as the future of Northern Ireland. But you've been wrong about Brexit in many ways as well. I mean, in your columns, there was always this sense that it's not really going to happen. I think at a public talk last year when you were asked, what do you think is most likely to happen in January, you almost plugged for a second referendum, one which would miraculously turn the UK away from this perilous path. Today, in fact, today is interesting because just yesterday the British Parliament actually signed and passed the last order paving the way for Brexit. 31st January is the D-Day, and I see some applause in the back as well. Did you ever see this day coming?
So, you're absolutely right. So my instinct was always that it was unlikely to happen. But of course, it was a very strong possibility. I mean, people voted for it. The legislation was there. Remember, for most of the period I've been writing about Brexit, there was no withdrawal agreement, right? So it was impossible to make a withdrawal agreement. The withdrawal agreement was made only because Boris Johnson and his government agreed to do something absolutely extraordinary, which was to effectively cut off part of the UK, Northern Ireland, and say, actually, Brexit won't really apply in part of our own state. Boris Johnson said no British Prime Minister could ever agree to do that. Theresa May said, no British Prime Minister, it's not just me, it's just absolutely impossible that this could ever be done. And then Boris Johnson just did it because it suited him. So yes, maybe I underestimated the degree of cynicism that's involved.
He then said he would rather die in a ditch than stay with it.
Yes, he did say he'd die in a ditch. But the question is, so what I've always argued is that the Brexit that people were sold, the thing they were told they were getting, is impossible. It's never going to happen because it can't happen. The European Union cannot give the same advantages to a non-member as it gives to its members. Why? Because the European Union is over if it does that. It just finishes. I mean, why would you pay to be a member of the tennis club if you can play on the court without being a member? You know,
or if the non-members get a better deal, then
yeah,
they get the fish and chips for free.
Yeah, so the basic proposition is impossible. The question is now that they are going to leave. I mean, they're going to leave at the end of the month. But remember, this story is now only beginning.
Right.
The most painful thing you can say to people in Britain is they genuinely think it's over. People say to you, oh, I don't care about anything about Brexit anymore because it's now over. It's done. Remember, Boris Johnson's very successful slogan in the election was, get Brexit done. And people said, okay, I'll vote for that. Think about that for a second, right? Which was, the initial proposition was, this is going to be the beginning of a golden age. This is going to be the most wonderful thing that's happened in the entire modern history of Great Britain. Now it's get it done. It's a horrible thing we have to go through. And Johnson, this is the brilliance of having no shame, right? So the very person who caused the crisis in the first place, more than anybody else, wins an election by saying, I can make it stop. I can make the pain stop. I can make it go away. But of course, the problem is, it's not going away. This is a generational question. I mean, the amount of tedium and boredom and awfulness that they're about to go through in terms of trying to negotiate trade deals with the European Union and to settle their relationships, I don't think people have any real understanding of that yet.
Well, that's a real shame, because here in India, we've been waiting for this Brexit thing to get over so that India and the UK can begin a trade deal negotiation as well. Now, you, through the book, have spoken a lot about English nationalism.
Yes.
The idea that it's almost to the exclusion of Wales and Scotland. But is that English nationalism really that unique? I mean, just look around. In Europe, we've seen similar movements in Poland, in Hungary, parts of East Europe, in Germany and France. The governments are really battening down the far right, which is really there at the door. In India, we see a hyper-nationalism of its own. The US is busy making America great again, with all due respect to the ambassador sitting here. And so in a sense, isn't just the act of Brexit, this Eurosceptic xenophobia that seems to have overtaken the English as you describe it in your book, isn't that actually the most global of all trends?
Yes, you're absolutely right. However, so there's no question that what's happening in Britain is completely part of this global trend. And of course, this is the irony that it's the irony that applies to all of it, that these are nationalist movements that are in fact highly globalized. Right? They see themselves as reactions against globalization, but in fact they're expressions of it. However, one thing that's really important to understand is that English nationalism is different in one respect, which is that it dare not speak its own name. So Indian nationalism is Indian nationalism, Polish nationalism is Polish nationalism, Hungarian nationalism is Hungarian nationalism, English nationalism is British nationalism.
Right.
And this is what we really have to understand here. So one of the things that's going on underneath this whole upheaval is that you have the development very rapidly, so really from the turn of the century onwards, roughly from the year 2000, you can see very rapidly rising identification of English people with being English, not British. So this is a response to two things. One is the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, the peace deal in 1998, which says, well, Northern Ireland can go anytime it wants. So it makes Northern Ireland's position in the Union kind of provisional. And then the establishment of the Scottish Parliament the following year. So 1999, you have the Scottish Parliament, you have the Scots saying, well, we're Scottish. And not unreasonably, by the way, perfectly legitimately, English people start saying, well, what about us? We're English. Do we not have a right to be English? And the answer to that question is, of course you do. Englishness is a very old, very rich cultural national identity. What's distinctive is that it's an identity that folded itself into two other constructs, one of which was the United Kingdom, which is not that old, by the way. It's only 1707. You know, it's not like it's some kind of, you know, ancient natural construct. It had to be created in the 18th century. It has changed radically. Ireland came in and then left, you know, so it's a very malleable, open kind of structure. And the English, for most of that period, said, okay, fine, we're part of Britishness, and of course also then part of empire. So you have these two other constructs that fold Englishness into them. What happens, well, empire's gone, so that doesn't work anymore, but also the UK is going, Britishness is going, or is becoming more problematic.
How did it manifest itself? What do you think that English people felt most afraid of losing?
Well, so I think this is the great question, and it's very difficult to answer precisely because this is what's different. So it's a nationalism which has no articulation. There is no English nationalist political party. Even the Nigel Farage's party called itself the United Kingdom, you know, UK Independence Party. The Brexit is essentially an English nationalist movement. But what does it talk about? It talks about the precious, precious union, Britishness. You know, it wraps itself in the United Kingdom flag. Whereas we know, and this is, I'm not making this up, so if you look at it in very detailed surveys, people who voted for Brexit are, first of all, overwhelmingly English. And secondly, they say, if asked, do you care if Scotland becomes independent? 75% of them say no. Do you care if Northern Ireland leaves and joins United Ireland? 75% say no. We want to be English. But nobody is giving them a voice. Nobody is saying, well, actually, this is a perfectly legitimate thing to want to be. What is it you want? How do you want to express it? What kind of democratic structures do you want? What culturally does it mean? Because Englishness can't be going back to the 14th century. It's a multicultural society. So what does it mean to you? Nobody's really giving them a chance to debate those things or to come up with answers. And the only thing they were offered was Brexit. So Brexit is offered as, this is the way you can express your Englishness. Okay. Now, it's very powerful, therefore, because it becomes a vehicle for all of that resentment, and it works. It's also very problematic because it doesn't answer the question. Leaving the European Union does not answer the question of what does it mean to be English in the 21st century.
All right. You mentioned two constructs. Actually, there's a third in your book. You know, when you talk about populism theory and the idea of being anti-elite, anti-pluralistic, the truth is that it has to appeal not just to the majority of a country, but you have to find the aggrieved minority within the majority. Yes. In your book, that aggrieved majority, the aggrieved minority within the larger majority is the angry white man. So is that third construct of the Anglo-Saxon world, I mean, to put it very simply, is this English nationalism really thinking about a world in which maybe we don't have so much to do with Scotland and Ireland and Wales, but we do have a lot to do in common with the US and Canada and the old Commonwealth and Australia and New Zealand?
Yeah, so if you look at, insofar as there is a Brexit project, global project, of course, it is this global Britain. But what they mean by global is primarily to do with some notion of the old white empire. You know, so the obsession with the United States, of course, with doing a trade deal with Trump is primary. Australia, New Zealand, like, let's get the old gang back together again. Knowing that India is very problematic in terms of what its relationships with a new Britain might be. Knowing that Africa, you know, none of the African powers are queuing up to come back into the fold. So yes, it does have a certain kind of nostalgia for a white empire, which is present in it. And so what you have to remember, of course, is that there's no distinction here. You know, your earlier question about, of course, it's part of this sort of worldwide movement. It does share a lot with the Trump phenomenon in the United States. So a lot of it is people who are worried about losing status. So the big narrative of Britain has lost its place as a world power dovetails with you know, a personal thing about, I've lost my status. I've lost my status maybe as a worker, as a person who was in a trade union, who had all that kind of power behind them, traditionally in parts of England. But also, I'm losing my status as a man. We're in a world where you have these women, you have people of color, you have all these minorities who, as these people see it, they're able to use a narrative of oppression to get attention. Why can't I use it too?
All right. Interesting. Now, you've given us this picture of it. Here in India, we are given a slightly alternate view as well of what Brexit could mean for our relations with the UK. One of the theories that have been given to us, and there are many people of Indian origin who are in the cabinet as well and have won elections. I think 15 members of parliament won in the last, but split evenly between Labour and Conservative. One of the theories that was put around was the curry chef shortage theory. Explain that.
You may have said, I don't know if you saw this at the time, but so in the Brexit referendum campaign, it was a very, very clever campaign. It was obviously successful, very well run. And so one of the issues was immigration. There's no question. This is not saying that everybody who voted for Brexit is anti-immigration or racist, but it was a big issue. It was a big question for a lot of people. And you may remember one of the things that was focused on was Turkey. Slightly darker skinned people, they're going to join the European Union, which they're not. But, this was Boris Johnson was saying, Turkey's joining the European Union. That means the European Union is going to then include Syria and then maybe Iraq. And, you never know where it's going to end. You've all these brown-skinned people who are going to have a right to come. So that was on the one side. And then on the other side, particularly to appeal to voters of South Asian origin, to say, look at the shortage of curry chefs. You can't get a curry chef in an Indian or
because
Pakistani
you have to
restaurant.
Hire a European.
Because you have to hire, all this sort of stuff. The European Union won't let people in. Now, actually, not much of this was true. Britain still had entire control over Commonwealth or former colony migration. It always had and always has. The European Union has nothing to do with it. But it was used very cleverly to say, if we weren't in the European Union, we could stop the Polish people and the Lithuanians and all these other Eastern Europeans coming in, and we could have more migration coming from India and Pakistan and all the rest of it, which is very appealing to communities. And you feel, well, family reunification, all that sort of stuff would be very attractive. The problem is, I just don't believe it. I don't believe that the same people who were using anti-immigrant sentiment and using very deliberately targeting images of brown-skinned people at the gates of Europe, the barbarians who are waiting to come in and invade us, are the same people who are going to turn around and say, well, actually, we welcome lots more immigrants from India. That's the narrative. That's what Priti Patel would say, for example. I'm skeptical.
All right. When you look at the kind of polarization, and you can see, and I'm sure that there are those in our audience as well, who actually see Brexit not necessarily as a negative thing. But Brexit is not, as I said, it's not the only country this kind of polarization is seen. It's seen around the world where people on one side are increasingly unable to see any sense in what the other side is doing. What do you foresee as the future of the UK post-Brexit?
So I think you're absolutely right about polarization. Remember, it's a very, very simple thing. So even 5 years ago, if you asked voters in England to list your top 10 concerns, the European Union was not in the top 10.
Really?
So it's a classic wedge issue, right? So you find an issue. If you asked them about Europe directly, a lot of them would say, I really don't like it, we should be out of it, But then you said, well, does this affect how you vote? No, it's not. It's just one of those things. But now, of course, it becomes the defining identity issue for people. And by the way, I have no problem with this in a way. I mean, people are perfectly entitled to say, let's leave the European Union if you know what the consequences are and if you've thought through what your future is. The question which you've asked is, I think, an absolutely key one, right? Which is, I don't think fundamentally most of this was ever about the European Union. It was about Britain. It's about its relationship with itself. It's about all of the same questions that arise in every other society about inequality, about exclusion, about people who feel they have no voice. I mean, it's all of those kinds of questions. But also then it's about nationalism and the forces that are tearing the United Kingdom apart. And so Brexit changes the dynamic of the UK. If we had been having this discussion here 5 years ago and we were asking each other about what's the future of the UK, we would have said, well, you've got to think about Scotland and Northern Ireland. We would not have been saying you have to think about England. Right. You know, so I'm Irish, as I said. We have a story in our heads, which is sometime Irish nationalism is going to produce the United Ireland. No, English nationalism is going to produce the United Ireland.
Bring you both closer.
English nationalism is probably going to produce an independent Scotland.
Are you sure this whole thing isn't an Irish conspiracy? Because correct me if I'm wrong, but the people who really do referendums is Ireland.
We do lots of referendums.
The UK had done, what, 3 referendums when they got to this point?
You know, I think it's a very good point. I mean, we, like you, we have a written constitution. You have a written constitution. So at least you know when you have a referendum, what are you changing? Britain has this wonderful paradox that I've never been able to get my head around, the unwritten constitution, which means that you can kind of say whatever you like about it and you don't have to define exactly what changes you're making at any given point. So therefore, referendums are not very good in a situation where you actually don't have a written structure within which to do it. But in terms of the Irish conspiracy, by the way, you could make a very good case. Nigel Farage, who was the UKIP, who probably kind of drove the thing more than anybody else. Nigel Farage, one of the great pleasures of Brexit, by the way, is Nigel Farage won't have a big salary from the European Union anymore. You know, he's made an entire career out of running against the European Union and taking huge amounts of money from the European Union. But his office in Brussels, on the door of his office in Brussels, is a portrait of the Irish nationalist leader Charles Stewart Parnell. And this is bizarre, right? So that England must become like Ireland. A number of the Brexiteers have cited Michael Collins, who was the Irish revolutionary leader who was out shooting British soldiers 100 years ago, as the inspiration for Brexit. You know, as this bizarre thing of English nationalists wanting to be like Ireland is one of the strangest outcomes of all of this. But one of the reasons they might usefully be more like Ireland would be Irish people are coming out the other end of zero-sum nationalism. We know what it's like when you have an either-or identity. If you say to people, you're either that or you're that, when you polarize in that way, we know that the likely outcome is extremely ugly. That you're playing with fire. You are risking the civility that holds together your society. And we know what that looks like. Look at it in Northern Ireland, where you have, you know, overwhelmingly white people, Christian people, people who share enormous amounts of identity. They can still kill each other for a 30-year conflict over what Sigmund Freud called the narcissism of small difference. And this is being created in Britain.
By the way, the many Indians in the audience are nodding away as he speaks.
But you know, it's being created in Britain. So India has these problems for very profound historic reasons. Sure. Ireland had the problem for very profound historic reasons. The strange thing in Britain is it's being unleashed as part of a sort of performative, almost camp game of wanting to play out this kind of stuff without really thinking about what the implications of it might be. If you're Indian or you're Irish or you're German or French, you know violence. Violence has been a part of your political society relatively recently. Britain's been very lucky You know, it's had no internal violence really since 1740s of any great scale. And I think, therefore, has become very complacent about this, that you can throw everything up in the air, you can unleash all of these forces of binary identity, you're either us or you're them, and it will have no consequences. It'll all be just a game.
And it's really like salami slicing, because once you do one binary identity, it's possible to continue to find more identities to divide people into. I just have a few more minutes before I do go to questions from the audience, so please do keep your questions ready. The first one being, I'm sorry, I have to use your pun over here. Is this for Brexiterity? As in, do you think we have passed the point of no return?
Yes, I do think Brexiterity is what's facing us. You see, because it's not going to be resolved. Why will it not be resolved? Because it's a nationalist revolution without a nation. Right? So it doesn't speak about what nation it wants. And it's a populist revolution without a people. You know, there are numerous peoples involved here. You know, there's Scots, there's Irish, there's Welsh, there's English, there's, you know, it has a kind of very fractured place in which to play out this drama. So not only are we looking at years and years of negotiations and compromises and rows over Brexit itself, but you're also then going to play out these divisions. Remember, in the 2019 election, the one that we've just seen, 53% of people in the United Kingdom voted for parties that were promising a second referendum. You know, the idea that the whole place is now united behind Brexit is just nonsense. It's just not true. The generational divide is very profound and very sad. It's a terrible thing to witness, where I talk to young people who say, I haven't spoken to my grandparents since the Brexit referendum. You know, I hate what they're doing. It's a very divisive issue. It really still, you know, has very profound consequences. At the moment, I think people are fed up with it, they're bored by it, they want it to go away. That's not a very good mood to be embarking on the biggest change that you've had for 50 years, to be saying, I just want it to be over, you know. And when people realize it's not over, like what happens when the car manufacturing plants start to close? Because they will close. Every single significant car manufacturing plant in the UK is entirely integrated into a European manufacturing system. If you take the Nissan plant in Sunderland, 3 million car parts arrive every morning in Dover from France. They are shipped straight to the assembly line in Sunderland. The end of the assembly line in Sunderland is a train that goes to the ship that takes the cars back to continental France. Now, you know, the Airbus, the great airline manufacturer, I mean, the only big rival that Boeing has. Airbus provides fantastic jobs, high-skilled, working-class jobs in different parts of Britain. But what does Airbus make in Britain? Wings. Now, maybe I'm missing something here, but there isn't a market for wings. You know, you kind of need
about a flight of investment.
You need to put them on a plane, you know. And the plane, it's an entirely integrated system where the rest of the parts are made in Germany and in France. So what's going to happen is Airbus is going to say, well, actually, sorry, we can't do this anymore. And it's not even about tariffs, although tariffs would be a problem. It's about delay. So all of these are just-in-time systems. None of these companies have warehouses, for example. You know, everything is assembled on the day, and it's moved in this kind of Japanese style. You know, the logistics of it are extraordinary. And they're just going to say, if you've got to do 3 million parts coming in every day, if every one of those parts has to be certified, you know, if something goes wrong and there's a delay, it means that your plant is sitting idle that day. You know, you just can't do it. Right. So what happens when this stuff starts to play out? I mean, Boris Johnson said, and excuse me for using the profanity, but this is what he said. He said, fuck business. You know, when he was asked about fuck business. Well, business is people's lives. It's you know, it's the way in which people get by in the world. And none of these impacts have been felt yet. And what you find with people in Britain are saying, Brexit's happened and it's all fine. You know, we were told it was going to be terrible, and look, it's all great. And you kept saying, no, it hasn't happened yet. You know, even if you know, presuming they leave on the 31st of January, they're still completely in the European Union until the end of the year. And you said a lot of my predictions have been wrong, so I'll give another wrong prediction, but I don't think they're actually going to even really leave at the end of the year, because the complexity of this is such that it's very hard to see how this is going to work out. So the consequences are going to start playing out, and those consequences are very unpredictable in a society which you have deliberately polarized. So when you polarize a society, then you start throwing out all these consequences. The big question is going to be, who is to blame? Brexit was always going to have been wonderful. We were promised this fantastic thing. Whose fault is it when it's not fantastic?
Well, we have the answer. Ireland's, of course.
Yeah.
With a show of hands, how many people would like to ask questions? There's somebody right in the front row, so maybe we should go to him, and then the lady there, and then the young lady there, and then I'll come back for a round.
Good afternoon, sir. I'll just give a small preamble, and my question is towards the end. Very, very small. And my question is towards the end of the preamble. The British Empire was built on the construct of 4 words, basically. It was conquest, plunder, loot, and bazaar. Incidentally, these 2 words, loot and bazaar, are Hindustani words. They've been made English words from the Hindustani language. Now that they built the empire across the globe, even through India, since they do not have either of these constructs working for them, there is no conquest, there's no plunder, there's no loot,
and there's hardly
any there's no bazaar. Is it the reason now that the British seem to be imploding when they've been pushed to 900 kilometers by 360 kilometers of their island? And is it an Indian way for which it is cathartic for us to know that it is the law of karma playing up now for them?
This should be part of the Eat, Pray, Love session before this. The lady over there, let's take a few questions, if that's okay. There's a lady there with a question.
So there's 2 works that I've read before that this talk reminded me of, and they are quite different from each other, actually. One was Baudrillard's thoughts about the war already being over, and what you're seeing is a simulation, especially when you spoke about an imaginary freedom and an imaginary oppression, and also an imaginary populace, you know. And then the other thing I was thinking of is Look Back in Anger by John Osborne, the play that really built the idea of this angry young man in Britain. And I often hear stories about, like, oh, you know, the young man, the youths, you know, especially like the violent youths in the countryside of the UK or something. Like, I hear, like, it's almost something
You're speaking about football fans, or?
I've just heard, like, people of all kinds of ages, like, complaining about it, like, it's really a nuisance, you know. So, like, definitely, like, that, you know, how society creates soldiers. There is an imaginary sort of politicization or like a radicalization or something that kind of, you know, sets someone up for certain political leanings on the one hand. And on the other hand, the problem of the imagined problems, and your opinion on that would be?
Perfect. The young lady there, and I'll continue.
Good afternoon. Although it's like a political agenda or like a corny jokes, which I should say a lot from the political agenda or the juicier. But what do you think about the Brexit? It's also a political agenda. So, but what do you think about the Brexit? The new Brexit in the Britain, which splits by the ages and politics. Thanks.
Did you say Megxit?
Yeah.
You mean, okay, Meghan Markle's departure from the United Kingdom. All right. Sir, did you have a quick question before? Yeah, just pass it down to the gentleman here. Then I can come to this room. I'll come.
Thank you. I must compliment Fintan on one of the best presentations I've ever heard about Brexit. Unbelievably outstanding. If only some, and he is not English, British or Scottish. He's actually from a foreign country. Well, not a real foreign country, sort of foreign country. But there will be people in the, I mean, I believe very much as a remaining in Europe, and that's what I voted for. But there will be people in this audience here who've heard your presentation, and will they have changed their mind? I'm not sure. But if I was to meet them, we'd end up having a big argument, as I've had arguments over the last 3.5 years, because we had no common sense put into it. I mean, I'm just really, I haven't got a question yet, so sorry. Yeah. The question is, how, do you blame Dominic Cummings for it all? Well, I do. He was a PR man for the Brexit, and that's who told the lies. So sorry, I haven't actually asked a question, have I? Yes. All right, but I wanted to compliment you on an outstanding presentation.
Thank you very much.
All right, so you have karma, angry men, and Megxit to deal with all in one.
Yes. Thank you very much for that preamble. I thought it was brilliant, actually, by the way. You really captured it. You know, is there a karma at work? Well, yes, in the sense that the overhang, the mental overhang of empire comes back to haunt the mother country. You know, so it's. I remember seeing somebody being interviewed, obviously quite a poor woman in the Midlands, you know, of England, and she was being asked about some of the questions I was saying about, you know, what happens if the car plant closes? And she said, look, we are the only country in the world with great in our name. You know, that's the answer, you know. So what empire, the legacy of empire is a sense of exceptionalism. And of course, this does relate very much to Trump as well, you know, American exceptionalism. But even older than American exceptionalism is British exceptionalism. Why can we do an empire? Because we're better than other people. You know, we're doing them an enormous favor by coming and conquering them, you know, and bringing our civilization to them. And you don't get rid of exceptionalism really quickly. It's as we have seen, it stays for a very long time. Remember, even the pro-Remain argument in Britain was framed as, we shouldn't leave Europe, we should lead Europe. Well, yeah, fine, but like, what gives you the right to lead Europe? I mean, you know, could you not just be, you know, one country in Europe? You know, would that not be okay? But there's a really profound thing that it wouldn't be okay, and that does go back to empire. You know, it does go back to the sense that we're not like other people. So yes, there is that kind of karma. The angry young man thing, you know, is a very well-made point, I think. One of the things I write about in the book is punk. You know, it's not accidental that Boris Johnson, when he was running for mayor of London, you know, used the Clash, which is rather extraordinary, or that Johnny Rotten is in favour of Brexit. But if you think about the demographic, if you were a young man in England during the great punk explosion, you almost certainly voted for Brexit. You know, you're that age group where you voted for Brexit. Why? Because it's also about, you know... Yeah, exactly, you know. So it gives you this sense of, which is in a way very admirable. I mean, one of the things we really like about the British is this sort of attitude, you know, this rebellious streak, this kind of, because it's also produced, of course, so much of their great culture, you know, so much of the brilliant theatre, movies, comedy, you know, it's a playful way of acting out a sense of being different. And it has been very, very powerful. But the problem with it is that, you know, really, the gesture in this case becomes a gesture of self-harm. One of the more worrying things about punk was the masochistic side to it. You know, piercing your skin, you know, wearing bondage trousers. There's a great statement, which I quote in the book, by Malcolm McLaren, who was the guy who basically ran the Sex Pistols, but they also put Johnny Rotten in bondage gear, and he said, putting Johnny Rotten in bondage gear was a great symbol of English freedom. And I think, okay, right, how do you deal with that? So there is all of that sort of stuff. I think there's a thing as well you have to remember, which I don't really deal with in the book, and I've only been really thinking about it since, but one of the things you've got to bear in mind here is what happened to disaffected young men in England. They joined the army. You put them in the army and you sent them off to other places. One of the things you can't leave out of account with all of this Brexit stuff is Iraq and Afghanistan. The British army got defeated in Basra, and it got defeated in Helmand, and those bodies started coming home, and none of the British population sees this as glorious anymore. That sort of whole military culture of young men, which has been very powerful as a solvent in the society, is disappearing as well.
Sense of pride, as you put it. Questions from here. Let's go from the back this time. Go ahead. You need to take the mic, yeah. Why don't we come to another question and we'll get you another mic. Okay.
I'm H.R. Swami, retired professor. My question is how Brexit will impact Indo-UK trade relations. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. There's the lady right next to you. Right next to you. Okay. Back and behind. Yeah.
Well, I'm very English, and I voted to remain, and I do not want to lead Europe, and I would like you to comment, say a bit more about people who did vote to remain.
Yes.
And democracy or no democracy, I feel that the result was so close, and I believe Nigel Farage said he would not have accepted it. It was such an important thing. And those of us too many of us who voted to remain, and we could not be ignored. That makes me angry. And the other thing that upsets me and a lot of people is what were the politicians up to in all of this? Did they have any honor? Did they have any value for Great Britain? Did they vote from a sensible point of view, or were they just furthering their own nests?
Those are all great questions, ma'am. Why don't we come right here? Yeah. There's a lady here.
Hi, thank you. You implied that Brexit will accomplish what the IRA and decades of fighting were unable to do. So my question to you is, do you see any evidence for this? Are there surveys in Ireland? Are there any public discussions that are giving you, some evidence for it heading in that direction? Thanks.
Great. I'll just take those three very briefly.
And you never answered the Megxit question.
The Megxit, I have to answer the Megxit question as well. Okay, so briefly, the Megxit question is very interesting because it shows that the British, Meghan joining the British royal family was the best thing ever happened to them. It was a really, if they planned it, you would say this is absolutely brilliant. It's really what they need to do, to create a new image of Britishness, which is multicultural, which can embrace, a woman of color, having a child who is the child of a woman of color. This was a fantastic thing for them to do, and the failure of it, I think, is a symptom of the identity crisis, of how difficult they're finding it. The way that woman was hounded out, by the very same, you can't leave out the tabloid press and all of this. Britain has the most feral, disgraceful, shameless tabloid press in the world, which is saying quite something. And as a journalist, it's a shameful abuse of journalism. And Meghan was a victim of this, you know. But she's not the only one. In terms of trade relations and the Remainers, I might answer this question together in a way, because the issue here is that given that the place was so divided, given that it was almost half and half and could have gone the other way on a different day, the logical outcome was to try to do a very soft Brexit, right, to remain very close to the European Union, which after all is what Boris Johnson said it would be. Boris Johnson thought that Britain would still have a seat on the European Commission. He said this publicly. He'd still have a seat on the European Commission after Brexit. You know, it won't make any great difference. He was either lying or he just didn't understand the thing. But the logic was a very soft Brexit. However, they've pushed it towards a very hard Brexit, which interprets the mandate of the referendum in the most radical way. But then this comes to the gentleman's question about trade relations. You still have to choose, and they still don't know what the choice is. You can choose to you cut yourself off from your main market, which is the European Union, with terrible consequences. Or you can remain close to your main market, which is geographically where you are. But if you're going to take the second option, you have to follow European rules. The European Union will not allow Britain to trade on different terms from people who actually follow European Union rules. And that is not worth doing, because it means that you end up as a rule taker. Britain will have to follow all the European Union rules in perpetuity to keep its trade going, but it will have no democratic input. It's the worst possible outcome. And nobody would have chosen that if that's what they were offered. But it's still the most likely outcome. And that, in turn, will affect the ability to do trade deals with India, with the United States, with everybody else. Just a last thing, a very interesting thing happened just yesterday. Very quietly, Britain announced that it's going to prioritize its trade deal with the European Union over its trade deal with America. Of course, what that means is they're recognizing that we're stuck as a satellite of the European Union. Who would have wanted to be second-class members of the European Union? If the European Union offered them this, they would have said, how dare you? We are first-class members. We're staying in. Maybe that was the mistake the European Union did make.
We have to leave it over here, but I do have one last question. This is from Sumit Kumar, who is the contest winner of the Rajasthan Patrika contest, about a question for you, and it should be a simple one. What books are on your bedside table?
The books on my bedside table. I'm reading a book of poetry by a young poet who is here called Stephen Sexton. He's going to be reading, and he's really new, and nobody had ever heard of him a year ago, and he's just published an absolutely brilliant book of poetry, and I'm absolutely wrapped up in that. It's really wonderful, and he's really worth going to see. I met him very briefly last night here. I didn't realize he was here. That's absolutely stunning. I'm currently I'm reading John le Carré's latest thriller. Le Carré, by the way, more than anybody else, you know, turns out to be the person who got the whole mentality of the thing. They're not really thrillers, they're great political books. I didn't answer the question about United Ireland. All I will say is that the evidence for this is twofold. One is Britain has just cut off Northern Ireland, so you know, they've decided Northern Ireland's going to remain more or less in the European Union. That's a huge thing. The second thing is that all the evidence shows that people in Northern Ireland were happy enough to be in Northern Ireland, except for Brexit. So people were saying, Catholics in Northern Ireland, basically saying, if Britain leaves the European Union, well, then we don't want to be in it anymore. So those are...
Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for Fintan O'Toole. If you still want to know what the prawn cocktail flavored chips are about, you're going to have to read Historic Failure. But thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much to our wonderful panelists, Fintan O'Toole and Suhasini Haidar, for that insightful discussion. And a very big thank you to Rajasthan Patrika, the leadership series, for presenting the session. I believe Fintan will be signing books in the book signing area in the back there. So if you would like to get a copy of your book signed, he'll be back there momentarily. Please help us keep the venue clean by taking anything you brought in with you, please take out with you and dispose of in the many bins that are placed around the venue. Please don't litter the venue, don't leave anything behind. Thank you.
Teamwork Arts takes India's artistic diversity to the world across continents, traversing from Australia, Canada, China, Egypt, Germany, Hong Kong, Singapore, South Africa, Russia, South Korea, Sweden, UK, and the USA in its stunning array of 16 international festivals in over 40 cities. A feast for the senses, these are spectacles of dance, music, cinema, theatre, literature, and so much more. Teamwork Arts, celebrating the arts. For more information, visit teamworkarts.com or follow us on Facebook and Twitter.